My wife decided to be a surrogate mother for her best friend without telling me. My body, my rules, she said, as if that ended any argument, as if the pain of being excluded from a decision that would change everything between us was just a whim. It wasn't about the body. It never was. It was about trust. About being one. About sharing the burden, the choices, the future. It was about what made us a couple. What made us whole. And when she said that to me, looking into my eyes, confident, firm, almost defiant, I realized the bond had been broken. There was no scream. There was no scene. There was silence. A silence so loud I heard the end knocking on the door. I stood up, grabbed my keys, took a deep breath, and replied with the calm of someone who knows the greatest pain was yet to come, respect your body and I'll respect my relationship. It's over between us. I'm going to my lawyer now to sign the divorce. And I left. I left without looking back. Because I knew that if I did, I wouldn't have the strength to leave. For days, I wondered if I'd overreacted. If I should have listened more, talked more, waited longer. But the truth was too cruel to ignore. She'd made a decision alone about something that would alter everything we built, and she'd chosen to hide it until the very last moment. It wasn't courage. It was ego. And no matter how much she tried to justify herself with words like altruism or solidarity, what pierced me like a knife was the fact that she'd chosen to hide it. She'd chosen not to include me. To exclude me. To erase me from the equation of a life that still bore our name. And in that moment, the love I felt for her, a deep, loyal, complicit love, shattered into tiny shards, impossible to put back together. I loved that woman like I'd never loved anyone. And that's why it hurt so much. We were happy. Intensely happy. And there's nothing worse than seeing happiness drain away in the eyes of someone who, until yesterday, was your everything. Her betrayal wasn't physical. It was emotional. It was the choice to walk alone where we always said we'd walk together. And that, for me, was the end. Not because I stopped loving. But because I understood that loving isn't about enduring everything. Truly loving is about being two in every decision that matters. And she took me away from that. She coldly ripped me from the center of her life. And even though she later claimed to love me, it was too late. Her love failed when it needed to act. She tried to come back. She tried to explain. She cried, she knelt, she wrote letters, she sent me audio messages at 3 a.m. But nothing could bring back that day. Nothing could erase the look in her eyes when she said, "My body, my rules," as if I were an enemy, an obstacle, a formality to be ignored. That look stayed with me. And that's why, when she came to me months later, saying she understood everything now, that she regretted it, that she would do everything differently, I responded with a single sentence, "I forgive you, but I'm not going back." The years passed. And in time, I found love again. A calm, mature, light love. A love that asked before deciding, that shared before imposing. That looked at me as if to say, "Us first." It was different. Not better or worse. Just different. A love that knew the weight of silence. That didn't play with promises. And that made me realize I deserved more than trying to fix what was already broken from the start. I moved on. Not without pain. But with dignity. And she stayed. I learned, years later, that she couldn't hold on to anyone. That her relationships crumbled when she tried to be owner of her own story, without learning to include the other person in the narrative. That she spent nights awake, remembering the early mornings by my side. That she still kept my perfume. That she listened to old songs and cried. That she told her friends that she ruined everything with an act she thought was noble, but it was just pride. I never wished her harm. But life has strange ways of teaching what love tried. They say time heals everything. That's a lie. Time only teaches. What heals is understanding. Awareness. True repentance. And that, sometimes, comes too late. She started having a recurring dream. They told me about it. A dream in which I returned. In which I hugged her. In which I told her all was forgiven and that there was still time. She would wake up crying, confused, with the feeling that there was still room for repair. But there wasn't. And as cruel as it sounds, life doesn't always give a second chance to those who ruined the first. I'll never forget the last time I saw her. Her eyes were red, her hair tied back, and she had a tired expression. She told me she just wanted to know if I still thought about her. I answered honestly, yes, I do. But not with desire. With longing. Longing for what we were. And what we could have been, if you had chosen us. She wept silently. And for the first time, I felt she finally understood the weight of choice. Not the consequence. But the real weight. The hole that opens when you risk losing someone who loved you completely. She was never the same again. And neither was I. But the difference is that I was reborn. She kept trying to piece together the pieces of a life that no longer existed. Trying to find meaning in silent nights. Trying to replace love with distractions that lasted only a season. Trying to convince herself she did the right thing, even when everything around her said otherwise. And when she finally stopped lying to herself, she understood. She understood that trust isn't regained with excuses. It's regained with time, patience, and the right choices. And she didn't wait for any of those things. She acted. Alone. Too quickly. With ego. And she paid the price. Today, she wakes almost every morning from the same dream. A dream where we're lying there, smiling, her head on my chest, my hand in her hair. A dream where everything is okay. Where we're still one. Where life hasn't been shattered by a solitary decision. Where there's still us. But she always wakes the moment I touch her face and say, we still have time, if you want to try. She wakes. And she's alone. The house is dark. The bed is cold. And I'm not there anymore. I never will be again. And if someone were to ask her today what hurts the most, she would answer sincerely, the pain of losing someone who loved me completely, for not knowing how to love as a couple. The pain of waking up from a good dream, and remembering that I was the one who destroyed reality. And that's why, to this day, she waits. Waits for a call. A message. A sign. But all that remains is the echo of a choice, and the memory that, once, she had it all, and threw it away with a gesture she thought was freedom, but which cost her the love of her life. But did she really understand what she lost? Or does fate still have something more cruel in store, something that neither she nor I could ever foresee? Welcome to the channel where love is taken seriously. Here, we do not support any kind of betrayal, on the contrary, our stories show how it destroys lives, corrodes relationships and tears away the most precious thing between two people, trust. All the stories you hear are fictional, but they carry deep emotional truths. They exist to make it clear that cheating is always a choice with devastating consequences. Get ready now for a story intense, realistic and shocking, the kind that moves the soul and leaves its mark. Press play, and feel the weight of a wrong choice. Daniel had always been a reserved man, the kind who stands out not for his grand gestures but for his attention to detail. His love was silent but firm, it was in the coffee he brewed before the alarm clock rang, in the coat draped over her shoulders without a word, in his attentive listening even after an exhausting day. He wasn't the type to promise the world, but he made everyday life a safe place. He worked in graphic design at a small company that gave him creative freedom and time to cultivate what truly mattered, the home he shared with Emma. They met at a photography event, something casual and unpretentious, and there, amid laughter and lingering glances, blossomed what would become a love that, for a long time, seemed unshakable. Emma was the opposite of what one would expect from someone who falls in love with a man like Daniel. She was expansive, spontaneous, full of life and opinions. A woman with a light that was hard to ignore. A psychologist by training, she had a passion for social causes, intense debates, and long hugs. It was this contrast between them that created the magic. She brought color to his gray days, and he gave structure to her intensity. They functioned as the balance they both didn't even know they needed. She, with her vibrant energy, pulled him out of his comfort zone. He, with his steady silence, anchored her when the world seemed too much. Together, they built a space of respect and growth, where differences were a bridge, not a chasm. In the early years, their connection was evident. Friends saw them as an ideal couple, the kind who still glance at each other over dinner as if they were just getting to know each other. Their apartment was small but vibrant. Pictures with phrases that only made sense to the two of them, books stacked in unlikely corners, scented candles mixed with the clutter of routine. They lived lightly, without great luxuries, but with an abundance of affection. Daniel, methodical and careful, was the one who organized their finances, while Emma guided the spontaneity of their weekend plans. Their arguments were rare and resolved the same day, often with laughter. So far, nothing hinted at any rift. Over time, as in any long-term relationship, changes came. Not sudden ones, but those almost imperceptible ones that accumulate without fanfare. Priorities began to shape themselves, and routine began to weigh differently on each of them. Daniel began to feel too tired to keep up with the social rhythm that had previously been natural with her. Emma, for her part, began to delve deeper into her side hustles, engaging in causes, volunteering, and studying motherhood, infertility, and women's health. There was a genuine nobility in her dedication, something Daniel admired, though he didn't always understand. His silence, once admired as stability, began to feel like indifference to her. Her statements, once charming, began to sound impulsive to him. But nothing serious. Nothing that felt like a real problem. The desire to grow together was still there. Together, they bought a used car after years of riding the subway, painted one of the living room walls a blue Emma had chosen unsurely, adopted a cat that appeared at the building's door one rainy night. In anyone's eyes, they were still the couple that made it. Even in their own. But silently, the small misalignments grew. Daniel felt that, amidst her whirlwind of initiatives, there was little room for the calm he so prized. And Emma, even without saying so, noticed how his eyes wandered more easily, as if they were always elsewhere. Still, the respect remained. And it was this respect that kept them choosing each other day after day, even in the most difficult ones. Emma had formed a strong bond with a longtime friend, someone who was facing serious difficulties conceiving. The two shared a special connection, a friendship born in college and strengthened by deep exchanges, secrets, laughter, and pain. Daniel knew her, of course. They had had dinner together several times, and he always found her intense yet genuine. There was something about her that reminded him a little of Emma herself in her most passionate moments. Between their conversations, of which he only heard fragments, topics began to emerge about motherhood, reproductive rights, empathy, and the idea of creating a life as a gesture of love and solidarity. Daniel, focused on his professional duties and maintaining balance at home, didn't realize how deeply this topic began to take hold within his wife. She often returned from meetings with her friend with her eyes shining, touched by stories, excited by the possibilities. He listened with mild interest, thinking it was just another one of Emma's phases, like the time she wanted to learn pottery, or when she got involved with Thai cooking. He believed that, as always, she sought meaning in experiences. And that was part of her. He never questioned it, because loving Emma also meant accepting her intensity. But there was a difference now. A quieter, almost secret emotional depth. She didn't talk openly about everything like before. Daniel noticed, but thought it was just a moment. A cycle of internalization. And as he always did, he respected it. They still slept cuddling, still exchanged caresses, still said, "I love you," before leaving for work. But there was less presence. Less listening. And, sometimes, more fatigue disguised as distraction. Still, no one thought about the end. Because love was there, breathing, even if less strongly. There were still plans, lists on the fridge, movies to watch on Sunday, birthdays to celebrate. There was still life. But perhaps there was a lack of conversation. Those long, unhurried conversations about what one truly feels. About what one hides for fear of appearing fragile or selfish. Daniel started leaving work later, not because he had too many tasks, but to walk alone. The silence of the outside world helped him organize his feelings, though he himself didn't know exactly what they were. Emma started coming home late, saying she was involved in a new project with her friend, something important, sensitive, necessary. And he, as always, trusted her. Because building a love with her always meant trusting in her intentions. He was never the controlling type, and she always valued that. Freedom between them was a sacred value. But at some point, perhaps, freedom turned into distance. And distance, misunderstanding. The stage was set, even if no one knew it. The decisions that would change everything were already being considered, though no words had been spoken. Daniel still believed life followed a natural course, with its ups and downs, but at a manageable pace. Emma, on the other hand, felt something in her soul begging for a greater gesture, a surrender that would reconnect her with a deeper meaning of existence. She needed to feel needed on a level that transcended the everyday. And perhaps, in this desire, she forgot something fundamental: no matter how noble a choice, it is worthless if, in making it, it silences those who should walk alongside her. And it was in this shared silence, in this seemingly ordinary daily life, in this love still alive but already wounded by small miscommunications, that fate began to draw the contours of what would be a profound rupture. Without clear warnings. Without visible alerts. Only with the blind force of choices made in silence. A story born of the truest love, but which would begin to unravel not with screams or explicit betrayals, but with the subtle absence of listening and the painful presence of solitary decisions. Nothing would be the same after that. And everything that was once certain would soon become doubt. Because love can endure a lot, but it never survives when it's no longer shared. And they, without realizing it, had already stopped sharing the same story. The next page was about to be written. And it would be the most painful of all. The routine continued to chug along like a train no one dared stop. The days passed with a strange fluidity, as if something were off-kilter, yet still functioning. Daniel would wake up before Emma, make coffee, mentally review the demands of work, and get dressed with the methodical calm of someone who believes they still have control over their own life. She, on the other hand, began waking up later, with heavy eyes and slower gestures, but she tried to disguise it with quick smiles and rapid-fire conversations about meetings, projects, reports, and goals that had never existed before. They still shared the same roof, but they no longer shared the same silences. The house wasn't cold, but neither was it warmed by that once spontaneous intimacy. It was lukewarm. And this lukewarmness was, without them realizing it, the first symptom of the distance that was silently growing, like a crack in a wall that seems too firm to give way. Emma came home later than usual. She made up last-minute meetings, coffee dates with co-workers, unavoidable appointments with her longtime friend. Daniel didn't suspect. He trusted. And that was perhaps his biggest mistake. He still believed that the love between them was stronger than any distraction, any separation, any change of direction. When she spoke, he listened, even if with less sparkle in her eyes. When she kissed him lightly before leaving, he kissed her back, even if with less passion. Not because he no longer loved her, but because something inside him, subtly, was beginning to disconnect without knowing exactly why. It was a kind of intuition that can't be explained, only felt. An internal warning that the ground was beginning to give way beneath his feet. Weekends, previously filled with joint plans, began to be invaded by her commitments he didn't quite understand. Sometimes it was a conference, sometimes a visit to an institution, sometimes an event with a friend who needed emotional support. Daniel, without complaint, began to occupy his own space. He went back to running in the mornings, signed up for an online advanced design course, met up with an old friend for a beer on a Friday. He tried to fill the empty spaces without realizing they were there. And when Emma looked at him, sometimes lingeringly, it was as if she wanted to say something but retreated before forming a word. There was a subtle, but still non-aggressive, tension. An unspoken discomfort. But they both pretended not to see it, like sweeping dust under the rug, hoping no one will point it out. One night, he arrived home early, an unexpected hour by the standards of the past few months. The living room was dark except for the dim light coming from the hallway. He took off his shoes and walked through the kitchen in silence, hearing a muffled sound coming from the bedroom. He considered calling her, but decided to just enter slowly. He found Emma sitting on the edge of the bed, her eyes glued to her phone, her body hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. She hadn't heard him arrive, and when she realized his presence, she jumped slightly and hit her phone almost automatically. He said nothing, just watched. She tried to smile, but it didn't quite come. She said something about a message from her friend, an urgent problem, a sensitive situation. Daniel nodded, but his silence screamed louder. That night, they slept back to back. For the first time in years. The tension began to become a new kind of routine. Emma avoided long conversations. Daniel stopped asking questions. They both knew there was something unsaid, but they preferred to avoid confrontation. Until, one late afternoon, she called him over to talk. Her eyes were steady, but there was a slight tremor in her hands. They sat at the kitchen table, the place where they had so often laughed together, discussed recipes, and dreamed of travels. The place that now harbored an almost palpable distance. Emma took a deep breath before beginning to speak. She said there was something she needed to share, something that had been important to her, a personal decision. She began speaking technically, as if reading a rehearsed text. She used words like act of love, gesture of solidarity, individual freedom, commitment to a greater cause. Daniel listened in silence, trying to piece together what was beginning to sound like an avalanche about to crash down. That's when she told him she'd agreed to be a surrogate mother for her friend. She said it with the strategic calm of someone who'd already rehearsed the right intonation for each sentence. As if the impact could be softened by the choice of words. Daniel was speechless. Time froze for a few seconds. What she was saying seemed like a provocation, a poorly explained metaphor. But it was real. She'd already agreed. She was already in the process. She'd already taken tests, signed documents, started preparations. All of it, without counting on him. Without talking. Without including him. Without asking. What hurt him wasn't the act itself, but the form. The exclusion. The unilateral decision. Her certainty that, even married, she could decide something so enormous alone. He tried to speak, but words were at a loss. Not then. She kept trying to justify it. She said it was about empathy, about giving another woman a chance to be a mother, about doing something great. Daniel just watched her, but his mind was elsewhere. A dark place, where love was beginning to crumble under the weight of omission. He no longer saw the woman he loved. He saw only someone who acted as if he were invisible. A background character in his own story. That's when she, as if expecting a compliment, said, "I thought you'd understand. I've always admired how understanding you are." He responded with a blank stare. And then, with a calm so sharp it hurt more than any shout, he said, "Respect your body, and I'll respect my relationship. It's over between us. I'm going to my lawyer now to sign the divorce." He stood up, grabbed his car keys, and left. There was no fight. There was no scandal. Just the raw certainty that the bond had been broken. The house fell silent. She sat there, staring into space. For the first time in a long time, Emma felt the true weight of a choice she thought was grand, but too lonely to be fair. The next few days were a blur. He didn't call. He didn't return messages. He left. And she stayed. With everything she had left. The bed, the books, the paintings, the silence. But what Emma didn't know, and what time would soon reveal, is that that decision hid something even deeper. A secret that, when revealed, would not only confirm the end but leave scars impossible to erase. Because sometimes, betrayal is only the surface of what's truly broken. And nothing, absolutely nothing, would prepare her for what she was about to discover. The months following the divorce were like a long emotional winter for Emma, a cold, dense time where the days seemed to drag on colorless, directionless. Daniel left the scene with the same silent determination he'd always lived with, no scandal, no promises, no return. She was left with what was left, the household items, the paintings hanging on the wall, the smell of absence, the huge, cold bed that had once been too small for so much affection. She tried to carry on with her life as if she hadn't lost what was most solid in her, trying to convince herself that it was still possible to find meaning in what she'd done. She kept telling herself that the decision had been noble, humane, necessary. But no matter how many times I repeated it, something inside her slowly crumbled, like a beautiful building beginning to collapse from within, without anyone noticing until it was too late. The people around her seemed to go on with their days. The friend she had done all this for was still present, grateful, smiling, saying she was eternally indebted. But there was an unease, a feeling Emma couldn't quite put her finger on. Sometimes she caught her friend avoiding certain topics, looking away when Daniel was mentioned, changing the subject when his name came up in some random memory. Small silences. Small discomforts. And Emma, though fractured inside, chose to ignore them. Avoiding further pain seemed easier than facing the possibility that her decision hadn't been as pure as she believed. She needed to believe that, despite everything, she had done the right thing. That the price paid, the loss of Daniel, the love of her life, had not been in vain. On the other side, Daniel tried to rebuild himself slowly. He moved to another neighborhood, rented a small apartment, and decorated it simply and in neutral colors. He kept his distance from social media, from his mutual friends, and from the memories that dragged him back to the past. He focused on work, immersed himself in personal projects, and resumed old hobbies. But something had changed in him. A certain weariness in his eyes, a bitter maturity, like someone who had learned the hardest lesson: love is not enough without partnership. He didn't seek new relationships, he didn't close himself off, but he also didn't force connections. He was at peace, albeit a solitary peace. Their reunion happened by chance. A supermarket, a wine aisle, an exchange of glances that froze time for a few seconds. Emma hadn't expected to see him. Daniel recognized her immediately, but didn't back down. They walked to the end of the hallway, exchanging polite, empty phrases. The weight of everything they'd experienced hung between them like a thick shadow. She tried to smile, he merely nodded. There was no hurt in his expression, and that was what hurt her most. The absence of anger, of pain, of any trace of feeling. It was as if she'd become part of a locked past. Before they said goodbye, she risked an impulsive gesture and invited him for coffee. He hesitated. He said he wasn't sure it was a good idea, but eventually accepted. Perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps out of respect for what they'd experienced, perhaps because part of him also deserved closure. The coffee took place on a cloudy Sunday. They chose a secluded, quiet spot. They talked about trivialities at first: work, moving, mutual friends. Emma seemed uncertain, her gaze seeking approval with every sentence. Daniel maintained a calm demeanor, listening attentively but without intimacy. When the subject finally turned to the past, she leaned in slightly, lowering her voice, as if confessing something important. She said she knew she had made a mistake in making the decision alone, that she had never intended to hurt him. She said she didn't know how much she would hurt him until she saw him leaving. He listened. He didn't react. He simply let her empty what she had been holding in all this time. That's when he blurted out, with disconcerting ease, that he already knew everything. But not just about the surrogate. He also knew what she was still hiding. She froze. The blood seemed to drain from her face. She tried to hide it, pretend she didn't understand, but his gaze was surgical. Daniel, with his usual calm, said he'd discovered something shortly after the divorce. Information he hadn't sought out, but which fell into his lap through a coworker involved in the legal side of the clinic where Emma had undergone pregnancy tests. Something that didn't make sense until he connected the dots. Emma looked away nervously. Daniel continued. He said that, upon learning she had done everything with her friend, without his involvement, he had already accepted there was no going back. But what he learned next, was the real final straw. He discovered that the child she had conceived wasn't simply the result of insemination with unknown donors, as she had implied. The pregnancy wasn't just a uterus donation. She had agreed to carry her friend's child with the man she had an affair with. A brief affair, according to the documents he saw. Yes, there was everything: contracts, terms, medical records. The child wasn't just her friend's. It was the result of a relationship between her friend and a man married to Emma. She stared at him, eyes brimming with tears, unable to respond. The silence betrayed more than any explanation could. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He showed no anger. Only sadness. And it was this sadness that made Emma break down. She began to cry, first quietly, then with uncontrolled sobs. She tried to explain that it was a mistake, a moment of weakness, that the man was no longer in her life, that he had been before she decided to become a surrogate. She tried to say that it all started with an emotional connection, not a physical one, and that when she realized it, she was in too deep. She said she accepted her friend's request to carry the child as a way to redeem what she had done, as if that could somehow erase the pain. But for Daniel, it was too late. He listened to everything with the serenity of someone who had already cried all his tears. He said that now everything made sense, the silences, the coldness, the rush to justify. He said he forgave, but not forgotten. That what tore him apart most was not the physical betrayal, but the decision to involve him in such a well-constructed lie. He said their love deserved more. And that she, no matter how many noble causes she had embraced, chose to save herself at the expense of his trust. And that choice was the end. Emma tried to get up, ask for more time, reverse something. But there was nothing left to be saved. Daniel wished her peace, serenity, and strength. He said he hoped, with all his heart, that she would learn from this. And before leaving, he left one last sentence: sometimes, the worst betrayal is not when the body surrenders, but when the soul lies. He was gone. And she stayed. For the second time, but now with the cruel certainty that she had definitively lost the only man who had ever loved her completely. And this time, there would be no dreaming to pretend that everything could still be the same. Emma left that cafe with weak legs, her chest sinking as if something inside her had completely collapsed. She walked the streets aimlessly, ignoring the wind ruffling her hair and the weight of the people around her who seemed to have defined destinies, functional lives, and aligned stories. Nothing made sense anymore. What she had previously managed to bury under layers of justification and silence now came flooding back. For the first time, she felt what it was like to live without excuses. Everything she had believed to be a selfless choice now revealed itself as a thinly disguised attempt to erase a guilt she had never faced. She had tried to give something noble to the world as a way to redeem a selfish mistake. But she didn't realize that, in doing so, she had only amplified the damage. Worse than the mistake was the attempt to hide it. And now, with everything exposed, there was nowhere to hide. In the days that followed, Emma isolated herself. She avoided her friend, her work, her family. She spent hours locked in her house, reliving every moment, every gesture, every word said and unsaid. The silence was now deafening. It was no longer the comfortable silence of a stable relationship, but the bitter echo of the absence of everything she once had and destroyed. She didn't cry every day. Sometimes she just stared at the ceiling for hours, feeling a kind of emotional numbness that felt more like punishment. It wasn't ordinary sadness. It was the pain of regret that wouldn't fade with time. A hole in time that no new love could fill. She tried to write to Daniel more than once, but rereading the messages, everything seemed too small compared to what had been revealed. Nothing you said could change the fact that she was responsible for the ruin of the truest relationship you'd ever had. And the cruelest thing of all was knowing that he, even wounded, had carried on with dignity, without ever taking revenge, without exposing, without humiliating. A few weeks later, trying to get back to some semblance of routine, Emma ran into a mutual friend. The conversation started off superficial, but soon drifted into questions about Daniel. She discovered, in that chance encounter, that he had started a relationship with someone. Her friend didn't give details, only saying that he seemed lighter, calmer, and more smiley. Emma listened in silence. She swallowed hard. She didn't feel jealous, she felt a more complex pain, the pain of knowing he was building something new with someone else, something she perhaps never quite understood. And for the first time, she felt there was no going back. The image of him with another woman hit her like an unexpected punch. Not because of jealousy per se, but because the realization finally sank in, the love of her life, the one she thought would always be there, albeit distant, even though hurt, was finally gone. The months passed. The maturation process was not linear. There were relapses, failed attempts at distraction, brief, shallow entanglements. But no connection could withstand the weight of what she carried. And even though the faces changed, the memories insisted on returning. Until one day, while visiting a bookstore looking for a gift for her niece, she came across a book on the new release shelf. The author's name sent a chill down her spine. It was Daniel. She picked up the book with trembling hands. On the back cover, a brief biography. And a title that seemed to scream, "Things We Didn't Say When It Was Time." She leafed through it quickly. It was a book of chronicles, reflections on relationships, on silent choices, on losses that could have been avoided. Each page was like a mirror, each paragraph, a blade. Emma bought the book without hesitation and read it all in a single night. She cried. Not just because of the beauty of the text, but because of the subtext that only she understood. It was about them. Every line. Every silence transformed into a metaphor. He had transformed the pain into something that would touch others. And she, who caused that pain, was now just a literary memory. Immortalized, but distant. Weeks later, she summoned the courage to send a message. Not to ask for a response. But to thank him for the book. She wrote sincerely, with an open heart. She said she had cried, that she recognized herself in every line, that she was proud of him for turning pain into a path to healing. She didn't expect a response. But it came. Brief. Respectful. Grateful. Daniel said that writing was his way of freeing himself. That he wanted her to be free too. That he had forgiven everything, but that life was now moving in a different direction. And that he truly hoped she, too, would find her new direction. Emma didn't respond. Not because she was hurt, but because she understood. That was the final goodbye. The goodbye they didn't have in person. And this time, there was no resentment. Only acceptance. In the following months, she began to rebuild herself. She returned to seeing patients, now with a more attentive, empathetic, and human ear. She participated in a project supporting women experiencing guilt and deep regret. She told her own story in a conversation circle, without naming names. She cried at the end. But for the first time, she felt that it wasn't just guilt she was carrying, it was learning. And learning, when true, transforms. Daniel, for his part, moved on with his life with ease. The new relationship wasn't born from an attempt to forget, but from a genuine desire to start over. The woman he was with was discreet, kind, and above all, whole. She didn't play games, didn't hold back, didn't hide secrets. She had a 5-year-old daughter who loved to draw and affectionately called him Danny. Little by little, he allowed himself to feel again. Without fear. Without reservations. And, most importantly, without open wounds. One day, while organizing some old papers, he found a photo of him and Emma on a long-ago trip. He looked at it for a few seconds. He didn't tear it up. He didn't keep it. He simply left it there, on the table, as if acknowledging the past without the need to cling to it. That was the day he knew for sure, he had completely moved on. Emma continued to have dreams about Daniel from time to time. Dreams in which he returned, in which they laughed together, in which everything was still possible. But when she woke, she no longer felt the despair she had before. Only a silent melancholy. A serene mourning. Because she had learned that certain mistakes cannot be undone, but they do have lessons. And hers was clear: when one chooses to walk alone on a road meant to be traveled by two, one loses not only love, but the right to return. And this, she would take with her. Not as punishment, but as truth. One afternoon, while attending a lecture on active listening and healthy relationships, she heard the speaker say, "Love is sharing the path, but also choosing the direction. It's not about who's in charge. It's about who shares." Emma smiled, her eyes brimming with tears. She jotted the phrase down in her notebook and, next to it, wrote in her own handwriting, "I lost the love of my life when I thought he was an obstacle." And he was, in fact, the foundation. She closed the notebook. She took a deep breath. And left the room knowing that, despite everything, she had become a better person. But, unfortunately, too late for the love she lost. Time, with its silent way of healing wounds, began to do what no conversation, letter, or attempt at reconciliation could: put everything in its rightful place. But place, in this case, didn't mean forgetting, but acceptance. After the last message exchanged between them, Emma learned the cruelest meaning of renunciation. Not the renunciation of a love lost to external circumstances, but of a feeling she herself sacrificed, believing she could keep it intact while making solitary decisions. Daniel had become the past, but not an ordinary past. He became a precise, vivid, almost tangible reminder of the woman she had been and the woman she now tried not to be again. And even as the days passed, as projects blossomed, and as smiles slowly returned, there was a territory within her that would remain forbidden, untouched, like a locked room full of objects one could no longer touch, but also dared not throw away. The news that Daniel was engaged didn't come through social media, nor through mutual friends. It came by chance, from a nurse working at an emotional support project where Emma volunteered. The woman spoke enthusiastically of the intimate ceremony that would take place next month, mentioning that the bride was an incredible woman, a single mother, and that he seemed to radiate peace since they were together. Emma listened with a small smile, hiding the small earthquake that began inside her chest. It was no longer a sharp pain. It was a warm sensation, like opening an old letter and smelling again the scent of a life that no longer belongs to her. It was inevitable that this would happen, she knew. But knowing didn't make it any easier. The world moved on. And so did he. That night, at home, Emma sat for hours on her apartment balcony. She watched the lit windows of the surrounding buildings, wondering how many of those lights held happy stories, how many were about to collapse, and how many, like hers, were trying to rebuild something atop the rubble. She picked up her phone, opened her gallery of old photos, and allowed herself to revisit memories she'd long avoided. The two of them smiling on the beach, him sleeping with the cat on his lap, a note from him left on the bathroom mirror with an inside joke only they would understand. All of that now belonged to another life, and the woman standing there, alone on the balcony, was no longer the one he knew. She was different. More aware, more mature, but also marked. Touched by absence. Wounded by the memory of someone who chose not to listen when there was still time. There was a dilemma that silently consumed her inside. She felt grateful for having loved him, and for having been loved in return, but at the same time, she was unable to forgive herself. And the dilemma wasn't just between guilt and regret, but between respecting his decision and the deep, almost childish desire to see him again, to tell him face to face that she understood everything now, that she didn't want to go back, but needed to look into his eyes and show him that she was no longer the woman who had betrayed him in silence. She wanted him to know she had changed. That she had learned. And this became a constant burden. A desire she didn't dare to turn into action for fear of seeming invasive, or worse, selfish again. As if even the definitive apology, the one in her eyes, could be more about her than about him. Meanwhile, on the other side, Daniel lived his new stage with serenity. Not because the pain had been mild, but because he chose not to drag it out any longer than necessary. The woman he was with didn't try to erase the past, nor did she compete with the previous story. She simply offered presence, sincerity, and listening. And for him, after all, that was everything. Mornings now smelled of fresh coffee and the sound of children's laughter. Her daughter quickly grew attached to him, and the connection they built was natural, clean, and unhurried. He drove her to school, made pancakes on Saturdays, read her bedtime stories. He didn't replace the absent father, nor did he try to be a hero. He was simply present. And that, in that home, was enough. But even amidst the lightness of his new life, Daniel knew that certain ghosts never disappear. Sometimes, during solitary walks, he found himself thinking about Emma. Not with desire, nor sorrow, but with a human curiosity about where she was, what she was doing, if she had managed to find her way. He didn't wish her ill. Quite the opposite. He hoped she was at peace. And perhaps that's why he never blocked her messages. He never closed the door completely. Not for reconciliation, but out of respect for the history they shared. And because, even when someone breaks us, there's still a kind of affection that persists like a final gesture of love, the sincere desire for that person to find themselves again, even without us. Emma, certain she wouldn't get another chance, wrote a letter. Not an email, not an instant message. She wrote by hand, with the blue pen he'd given her on their first Christmas together. She told him about the past few months, the sleepless nights, the volunteering, the lessons learned. She said she didn't expect a reply, nor forgiveness, nor anything in return. She just wanted him to know that the woman who destroyed everything with one bad choice was gone. And that the one writing now was someone who finally understood the value of shared silence, of love in the making, of listening before acting. She ended the letter by saying she wished him a lifetime of peace and love, and that if he ever read it, she hoped it would be with a smile, not pain. She didn't send the letter. She kept it in a box, along with other mementos, like someone finally accepting that some words need to be said just for the soul to find peace. And perhaps, in that silent gesture, you did for the first time what you never knew how to do, respect boundaries, let the other person go without trying to bring them back. The final renunciation. The most honest farewell. A farewell that requires no audience, nor approval. Life went on. Daniel married in an intimate ceremony. His wife's daughter walked in with flowers, he smiled with teary eyes, and for the first time in a long time, he felt exactly where he was supposed to be. Emma learned about the wedding by chance, in a brief conversation with a former colleague who still had some mutual contacts. She didn't cry. She just closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The pain was different now. It was a longing for a time that had existed but would never return. And that was okay. Because in that moment, she understood that some losses teach us to be more whole. And she was finally ready to live with herself. Not as punishment, but as a new beginning. She didn't yet know what would come. But she knew it would be with truth. And that, in that moment, was all she needed. The week after Daniel's wedding, Emma decided she could no longer live within the walls of her emotional past. She needed to move, not just literally, but internally, emotionally, spiritually. The apartment where she lived still held shadows of happier days, echoes of his laughter, traces of the love that had departed. Every corner, every object, every detail of the decor seemed to carry a sigh. So she put into practice something she had been rehearsing for months, a complete change. She looked for a new place to live, smaller, simpler, in a different neighborhood, far from the paths that reminded her of what would never return. She wasn't looking to erase Daniel, nor was she trying to escape the guilt, she simply needed to start building new memories, where he wasn't present, even in the silence. The new house was modest, with large windows that let in light and street noise, and somehow, that felt good. The presence of the outside world made her feel that life was happening, with or without her, and that perhaps it was time to be a part of it again. The work on the social project began to intensify. Emma began dedicating more hours to helping women who arrived devastated by choices, betrayals, abandonment, and guilt that was hard to name. And the more she listened to others' stories, the more she understood her own. There was no complete redemption, but there was a kind of peace that blossomed when you stopped running from the truth. She used her experience, even without revealing names, as a tool for connection. She was honest with her words, firm in her listening, generous with her advice. This began to transform her little by little. Emma, who once had to justify everything, now listened. The Emma who once decided for two, now encouraged other women to think before acting alone. It was as if each conversation was a mirror, and each time she helped someone get back on their feet, a little piece of herself rose up too. It was in one of these group sessions, where grief swirled between knowing glances and heavy silences, that a young woman named Celine shared something that shook Emma. She had cheated on her boyfriend with her ex, hidden a pregnancy, and ultimately lost them both. He told her everything through tears, his voice trembling and his body cringing. She said the worst part wasn't being abandoned, but realizing no one was looking at her the way they used to. I could handle the regret. But not his indifference. Not that look that tells you you're no longer worthy of anger, she said. Emma closed her eyes at that moment, as if Celine's words echoed exactly what she herself had felt at the coffee with Daniel, when he looked at her with that calm respect that hurt more than any fury. And it was there, between confessions and tears that weren't hers, that Emma knew she had reached a new stage of her grief, the recognition of loss as part of what made her, and no longer as something that defined her. Later, alone in her new apartment, she turned on an old vinyl record and began reorganizing a box of old objects she kept only out of emotional attachment. Inside, she found the letter she'd written to Daniel and never sent. She read each line calmly, and when she reached the end, she realized she no longer felt the need to send it. That letter was a portrait of the woman she'd been months ago, still filled with the need to be understood. Now, she no longer needed that. She no longer expected validation. She no longer sought reconciliation. She simply wanted to keep the memory alive, unfettered by guilt. She put the letter away again, but this time with a light touch. Like someone who keeps a finished chapter, not a still open wound. Days later, she received an unexpected invitation. One of her colleagues at the social center was organizing an event on emotional reconciliation and wanted Emma to be one of the speakers. The topic would be the impact of individual decisions within relationships. At first, she declined, saying she didn't feel ready. But her colleague insisted, remembering how much Emma had touched the lives of the women there. She thought about it for a few days and finally accepted. She prepared the talk with care, honesty, and courage. On the day of the event, she dressed simply, but her eyes carried something new, the silent strength of someone who has fallen, suffered, but rebuilt herself without haste. The auditorium wasn't full, but it was attentive. And when she began to speak, her voice was firm, straightforward. She told her story, without names, without exact dates, just the emotional truth. She revealed how a decision made without dialogue led to the end of the most genuine love she had ever felt. She spoke about the loneliness of guilt, about the need to take responsibility without drowning, about the importance of asking for forgiveness even when it isn't accepted. When she finished, there was silence. Not a silence of judgment, but of respect. Of reflection. And amidst the subdued applause, she saw emotional faces. People who, like her, were trying to understand where everything went wrong in their own lives. After the talk, a woman approached. She was older, with gray hair and a deep gaze. She squeezed Emma's hand and said, "You didn't just survive, my daughter. You became a shelter." That phrase echoed within her for days. Perhaps for the first time, she felt her pain had served something greater than her own relief. It was as if the cycle of self-destruction had become a channel of reconstruction. And that brought her peace. A few weeks later, as she was leaving a session, Emma was surprised by a little girl sitting on the steps of the center's building. She was small, her hair tied in two messy buns, and she was holding a colorful little book. The girl smiled and said she was waiting for her mother. Emma sat beside her, asking her name. "Clara," the girl said. She asked what she was reading. A story about a woman who lost something very important, but found something better within herself, she replied with the simplicity of someone who still doesn't understand the weight of the words she repeats. Emma smiled, holding back tears. Perhaps life was trying to tell her something there. Perhaps, in that pure and unexpected image, lay the most beautiful metaphor for her new phase. In the days that followed, Emma wrote again. Not to Daniel, but to herself. She recorded everything she'd experienced, not as a confession, but as a testimony. Maybe one day I'd post it. Maybe not. It didn't matter. What mattered was the clarity with which she could look at her story without shame or despair. The pain was now a familiar place, but no longer inhabited. The longing, a shadow that passed but no longer haunted. And love, that now took another form. It was no longer a desire for return, but a desire to see the other happy, even from afar. That was maturity. That was true love. And in the end, that was what she always wanted to offer, even if it took her too long to understand how. Months after the event that transformed Emma into a silent beacon of resilience and emotional courage for so many other women, she walked the streets with a different calm, a more upright posture, her gaze serene. There was no rush in her steps, nor any expectation of reunions or twists and turns. She had learned, slowly and harshly, that the end of a love isn't necessarily the end of her own life. And now, looking at the horizon while feeling the wind against her face, she could see a future where before she had only seen the past. It was no longer about trying to recover what she lost, but about valuing what she had built from what she had destroyed. Emma no longer sought to fill voids with distractions, nor did she use her pain as a flag. She simply carried on, with the maturity of someone who no longer wanted to be forgiven, but who had finally forgiven herself. One afternoon, sitting on a park bench with her notebook open on her lap, Emma saw a scene from afar that made her hold her breath for a second. Daniel was walking past a woman, laughing at something she had just said. The woman's daughter ran ahead of them, and he called to her tenderly, with a care so natural that it didn't seem like a reconstruction, but rather a whole new beginning. Emma didn't look away. Instead, she remained watching, a silent peace in her eyes. There was no meeting. There was no wave. But in that moment, she felt something profound, gratitude. Not for him having moved on without her, but for her having been able to not interfere. Love, when true, is recognized even in absence. And she, for the first time, felt she could love him without needing to have him. On the other hand, Daniel had also reached a new stage in his own story. His relationship with his wife was solid, built on honest conversations, mutual respect, and constant presence. He didn't shy away from talking about the past, but he also didn't bring it up often. It was like a story that had been part of who he was, but no longer needed retelling. The woman he was with knew he had loved before, deeply, and didn't try to compete with that. Instead, she chose to love the man he'd become after the chaos. And he reciprocated with the maturity of someone who has understood that loving someone is also about being willing to rebuild yourself whole before offering any part of yourself to anyone else. Little by little, their home filled with simple rituals, full of truth. Coffee on the porch, drawings taped to the fridge, walks at dusk. And in each of these details, Daniel found something he'd lost for a while, lightness. But fate, in its ironic and often symbolic way, still had one last piece to play. Emma, now a regular contributor to an NGO that offered emotional and legal support to women experiencing emotional trauma, was invited to write an article about emotional reconstruction after abusive relationships and breakups marked by silent betrayals. The invitation came from a magazine specializing in mental health, and she accepted enthusiastically. The text, written during nights of immersion and silence, became a brutal and sensitive portrait of her own journey. She didn't use names, but those who knew her knew where every word came from. The article went viral. And, among the thousands of comments, one in particular caught her attention. It was unidentified. It simply said, "You turned your fall into a bridge to other women. How proud of who you have become. Thank you for not going back. Life brought you back to yourself." Emma knew. No signature was needed. That was the answer she never expected to receive. The validation she hadn't sought, but which arrived like a breath of relief at just the right moment. The following week, she was invited to give a talk in another city. It was a larger auditorium, with an audience expecting to hear real stories, and she was ready. Midway through the presentation, as she delivered the most delicate passage about the loneliness that comes after making the wrong choice, she noticed a woman in the front row crying quietly. At the end, that woman came to her, saying she had been carrying the guilt for years of losing the right person due to pride and impulsiveness. Emma hugged her and said, "The pain of knowing you broke the heart of someone you loved is unbearable, but it transforms when you learn not to do it again, not even to yourself." They were both moved. And there, Emma understood that the impact of a story lies not only in the pain it carries, but in the light it shines on someone's path. Daniel, in turn, released a second book. This time, more optimistic. Less about loss, more about rebuilding. The love story with his wife inspired him to write about what comes after a fall, about how a heart in ruins can still harbor flowers. He hadn't forgotten what he'd experienced, but now he was writing with the hands of one who planted, not one who mourned. The book received good reviews, and more than that, it touched people. Some of them knew the story behind those pages, others didn't. And that hardly mattered. Because, in the end, what truly matters is what we do with the pain that permeates us. Daniel decided to transform it into something alive. Emma, into something useful. And they both moved on, not together, but whole. And then, years later, during a chance visit to an exhibition on effective memories and therapeutic writing, Emma and Daniel saw each other once again. This time, face to face. The exhibition brought together authors and participants with remarkable stories. She was there to moderate a panel on narrative and reconstruction. He was there as a special guest for the closing ceremony. Neither knew they were the unspoken protagonists of the same story that inspired so many others. When their eyes met, there was a brief internal silence. But nothing hurt. There were no more cracks, no loose ends. Just two human beings who had experienced something profound, lost each other, been hurt, and followed different paths, each with their own truth. At the end of the event, they exchanged a few words. A hug. A smile. An "I'm happy for you" that sounded more sincere than any declaration of love. And it was there, in the middle of a room full of strangers, that their story truly ended. Not with tears, nor pleas, nor promises. But with respect. And with the kind of understanding that only comes after a long time, and a lot of pain. They both left that place through different doors. With paths that would never cross again. But with the certainty that, however painful the journey had been, it had been worth it. Because sometimes you have to lose the love of your life to find the love of life itself. Now, take a deep breath and tell me, what did you think of this story? Have you ever experienced or witnessed something similar? Leave your comment below, I'd love to hear your opinion. If this story touched you in any way, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to receive more stories like this. Here, each narrative is a mirror, a scar, and, above all, an invitation to reflect. Remember, betrayal doesn't just destroy relationships, it destroys trust, memories, affection, and the possibility of a future with the person we love most. One selfish act can doom a lifetime of companionship. This channel does not support, normalize, and will never romanticize any kind of betrayal. Our purpose is to show, with truth and emotion, that love only survives where there is loyalty. Until the next story. May it also find you in due time.